Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar on Raising Them Up, Children, Faith, and the Church. My name is Amy Gingrich and I'm publisher and executive director at Menno Media. Since churches started meeting digitally in March with the onset of COVID-19, we've been thinking about how to deliver additional helps to congregations at this time. And it's out of that commitment that we have launched this Adaptive Leader series to accompany our ongoing Leader magazine. It's our desire to offer these webinars as a practical help to churches and leaders as we navigate together the seismic changes taking place in our society. I am delighted to welcome each of you today. Our webinar is being recorded and it will be available later this week on Menno Media's YouTube and Facebook platforms. During the webinar, I invite you to use the Q&A feature within the webinar platform to send in your questions. I will make sure we take some time for those at the end. Today, we have put together an amazing panel of pastors, professors, and thought leaders for our conversation on children, faith, and the church. In late July, Menno Media sent out a survey to our congregational customers in the US and Canada about their reopening plans. And we found that overall, churches at that time were still meeting digitally, and they were unsure about when they would resume in-person gatherings. We found that 36% of the churches that responded were not offering classes for children. Less than 17% of churches said that they would resume Sunday school classes when regular services began. 25% said no, and 59% were unsure. Nearly 40% of churches said they did not plan to offer nursery services when their regular services would resume. 51% were unsure. Today, we want to have an honest conversation about what's working and what's not. Many of us are looking for and struggling for ways to do faith formation with children and youth at this time. We want to share ideas that we might have for such a time as this. What does it mean if churches stop offering faith formation for families? What does that do to the church in coming years? And what's the burden or the opportunity here for families? Dave Csinos will lead our conversation today with our panelists. Dave is Assistant Professor of Practical Theology at Atlantic School of Theology in Halifax, Nova Scotia. He is founder and president of Faith Forward, an ecumenical organization for innovation in ministry with children and youth. He's a sought-after speaker and the author of several books, including Children's Ministry in the Way of Jesus, the Faith Forward series, and coming in November, Little Theologians. As we start, the panelists will introduce themselves and their contexts. Each panelist is also going to think back to March, when we all had to radically alter our lives in so many ways. So panelists, as we start, think about the first things that you did back in March to continue to nurture children's faith in your church. Dave, we'll start with you.
Great. Well, I'm delighted to be here. My name is Dave Csinos. I am coming to you from Halifax, Nova Scotia, and I teach here at Atlantic School of Theology. And so something that is really interesting about my context is that I get to work with both at my local church in Wolfville, Nova Scotia, or Port Williams near Wolfville. And I also get to work with students at Atlantic School of Theology from many denominations, but both Protestant and Catholic traditions, with a vibrant distance program that is distributed across North America. So it's been really exciting to see how different regions and different traditions are responding to this crisis. And one of the things I noticed that first weekend, or a couple weeks into the crisis, I had a conversation with a colleague in children's ministry. And she was saying, you know, we're both churchy people. We have churchy people on our Facebook and social media platforms. And one of the biggest concerns that she was noticing was pastors were saying, how do we do worship services online? And she said, it's funny that out of everything we do as ministers, this 1 hour seemed to take all the energy. One of the things that our church did, and the pastor of our church did, was, like everyone else, move to online services, and they were pre-recorded, and that gave the opportunity for him to kind of organize many different people to be involved. So it became a little more intergenerational because he could invite a family, a teenager, a university student that, lives on the other side of the country, to come together and all contribute a reading, a prayer, something that was then spliced together into a service. So it was a tremendous opportunity, I think.
So I'm Malinda, and I'm joining this webinar from Elkhart, Indiana, which is north central Indiana, on the campus of Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary, where I'm a member of the teaching faculty. I work in the area of theology and ethics particularly. And in some ways, I'm maybe a little bit of the odd fish here. That is, I don't do work specifically in the area of children's faith formation. However, I am, as Amy knows, heavily invested in these kinds of conversations, both because I'm kind of a self-styled peace theologian, right? So I'm working in the Mennonite tradition of peace theology. But I'm also a mother of 2 young children, ages 3 and 7. So these questions are very live questions for me personally, but also, kind of socially and in the milieu that I participate in as a parent. Another piece of, I think, a significant piece of my background here is that I was raised by a Sunday school teacher. My mother was an elementary school educator, but she has also written and offered peer feedback to many of the iterations of Herald Press and now Menno Media's Sunday school curricula. So this was just kind of part of the air that I breathed growing up, was not just sort of the importance of Sunday school as part of church programming, but the logic behind it and how one makes choices about the kind of content you bring to children as part of Sunday school, because it is linked to their faith formation and identity as people. But also this kind of Anabaptist, what we call theological anthropology, that how do we understand who and what children are theologically, was a huge part of my mother's own formation. She was part of the Goshen College, for those of you who are familiar with Mennonite systems of education, with that model of understanding the innate sort of spirituality of children and how that is a vital and vibrant part of congregational life as well as family life. So that has hugely shaped my sensibilities as a theologian. So you'll get to hear a little bit more about that as we continue. But back to this question, what did we start doing in March? My family is also in kind of a unique position of being in the only family with children in a congregation. So when we went to Zoom, like others, that meant spending most of the morning with our audio and our video muted, because when our kids could see themselves on the monitor, that just, the performance ensued. And so as we've kind of continued to participate in worship by Zoom, we've done things like, my husband's on the phone, I'm on the computer, so that we can be sort of running around and moving inside and outside, and just trying to kind of navigate that space. We've also discovered it's really important and significant to others in our congregation who don't have children in their home to see our kids and say hello to them and interact with them on Sunday mornings as well. But it's been an interesting ride.
I love so much of what you just said, Malinda. My name is Natalie Frisk. I'm the curriculum pastor at the Meeting House Church in Ontario, Canada. I come today to you live from Hamilton, which is just about 45 minutes outside of Toronto. I have been curriculum pastor in relation to the kids and youth curriculum development at the Meeting House for the past 7 years. I have been able to help oversee the development of curriculum right from scratch for us, from birth until the end of high school. And so I helped oversee kind of that wide age range. Wow, stumbling a little bit today. I'm so excited to be here. And in doing so, I have been able to interact with so many incredible people, some of which have encouraged me into working towards a degree in practical theology, doing my doctorate in practical theology at McMaster Divinity College here in Hamilton. And my kind of area of focus for my dissertation is going to be the spiritual experience of children. So very excited about how all of these conversations even play into what that's going to be like, because post-COVID realities, I think, are going to be fresh and new for many of us. I'm married. My husband and I have an amazing daughter who's 9 years old and is actually in school. Thankfully, we're in an area where we have very, very, very low COVID cases comparatively speaking to the rest of North America. Not as low as our friend Dave there on the East Coast. But in addition to that, during this pandemic, I actually became along with my curriculum pastor role, I became the lead pastor of one of our parishes. So I am in this conversation from the angle of curriculum pastor as well as lead pastor in an intergenerational context. And I'm also author of a book called Raising Disciples: How to Make Faith Matter for Our Kids. And so I'm excited for this conversation today. And to the question about what we kind of did right off the cuff in March, as everything was shutting down and we were kind of trying to figure things out, to be honest with you, because there were so many unknowns for so many families, and it seemed as though everyone was really just over communicated without any information, we hit the pause on over communication with our families. That's not to say we didn't reach out to support and to encourage, but we recognized that until we had a good strategy, there wasn't really a point to communicating with them, because there were so many messages coming from so many different places and spaces. Once we were able to take a breath kind of collectively, we put right into the flow of our work some changes in regard to creating a preschool video, so our preschool kids could interact in the same way that our grade school aged kids interact with a video lesson. We have reached out to encourage parents, helping them remember, recognize, and identify the fact that they are the spiritual developers of their own kids, and that we're here to support them in that. So we've kind of put the ask out in those early days to say, what can we do to best serve you? And their answer was often, we don't know. And our answer was often, great, because we don't either, but let's partner together and do this together.
My name is Henry Zonio, and I'm currently in Lexington, Kentucky. And right now, like our COVID numbers are starting to go up, so everybody's kind of concerned over here. But so I'm a sociologist. I just actually just recently finished my PhD, defended my dissertation, which was taking a look at how young children learn about race and gender within the context of Sunday schools. So I'm very interested in taking a look at spirituality from an inequalities lens, because my research interests intersect inequalities with children and religion and curricular development and all of those issues together. So, but prior to that, I was a children's pastor. I served for 5 years in Corvallis, Oregon, and then I was 5 years up in Thunder Bay, Ontario, on Lake Superior. So yeah, it went from rain to snow perpetually down to here where there's horses and rolling hills and all that stuff. But so yeah, I've got a unique viewpoint of being in the children's pastor realm, and then now on the academic side of stuff, taking a look at things through a sociological lens. Yeah, so that's where, like, I'm trying to figure out, okay, so what's all this education for? And trying to find a job in all of that. But it's been a while since I've actually been a children's pastor, like in the areas that, but I've been involved in our church here in Lexington. And so when COVID hit and we had to like not meet, our church went to, we didn't do Zoom, we used Facebook Live, and started doing live services from there. So it was just our pastor and the other pastoral staff. And actually we had two congregations. So one of the congregations that a former pastor at our church had planted, they came together to do joint services together. And so they tag teamed on who was doing the sermon, and we're an Anglican church, so we have the liturgy and all of that. So that was kind of weird to do all of that from sitting at home, like you're used to doing all this liturgy with everyone and you're talking to a screen this entire time. And so they were, as they figured out of what to do with the children, because our church was using the catechesis of the Good Shepherd model, so that's a very like immersive and model where you're with the kids and helping them experience all of these things and taking time to wonder and all this stuff of trying to figure out, so what do we do, since that's hard to do via Zoom or other online type methods. And what our pastoral staff decided to do was to resurrect the children's sermon, which I think was a good thing, because I remember the first time when it happened. And so the children's pastors from both churches tag team on it. And so they're at the very front of the service after the prayer at the beginning and before they go into the major part of the liturgy and the reading of the lessons. The children's pastors give a message to the kids. And so it's been interesting, because that has at least symbolically reintroduce the kids back into the congregation itself, rather, because that would have been the time where they dismiss the kids to have their own experience. And so it's been nice to see that, and talking to different people from our congregation, they've really appreciated it as well. It's like, oh yeah, we do have kids that are here. And they're hearing our children's pastors as well, who have been doing an amazing job of taking the lesson readings, like the gospel readings and the Old and New Testament readings, and contextualizing it for children. That sometimes you hear the comment from some of our adult congregants that, hey, I learned more from the children's sermon. And then also parents have been able to actually have conversations with their kids about what the lessons are, which also tie into the sermons. And so another unintended consequence of that is that when it comes to the sermon time, a lot of times whoever is preaching, whichever senior pastor is preaching from, will bring this children's sermon into their message a lot of the time. So again, it's been really neat to see kids being recognized, and that it's not a secondary thing. It's actually, and for it to be at the front there, to be able to do that. So I know that they're having conversations of like, okay, so how do we keep this dynamic going in the future?
My name is Becky Degan. I'm here in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, kind of halfway between Philadelphia and Harrisburg. I am the Associate Pastor of Worship and Christian Education at Forest Hills Mennonite Church. So I have a little bit of a unique perspective in that I'm both the worship pastor and the Christian education pastor, and there's a lot of carryover there. I've been on staff here at Forest Hills for 15 years, so I also know families very well. Before that, I actually worked in special education as a music therapist for 10 years. And then I went back and I got my graduate degree in elementary education, and then ended up here at Forest Hills for 15 years. So I have been hands-on doing this here. And I have a 13-year-old son, and one of the things that we did, the first thing we did when on a Thursday afternoon we found out that our state, Pennsylvania, shut down and we couldn't have any gatherings on Sunday, I was in this unique position of my 13-year-old was in his 4th year of cyber school. And so I had watched his teachers teaching on Zoom for 4 years. And it was so ironic because that week I had said to him, not knowing anything about COVID, I had said, I could do this. I could totally teach online at your school. And then they canceled everything. They canceled life. They canceled the world. And I emailed my parents and I said, we're not meeting in person. Here's a link. Go to it at 9 o'clock on Sunday morning. And I had 99% of my kids there. And my son gave me a crash course in between Thursday and Sunday of all the things you could do on Zoom, like educationally. And I looked at the Sunday school lesson I was going to teach and kind of made all those connections. And so we didn't miss a beat as far as that. And then I as parents kind of logged in on that first Sunday, you could see the panic in their eyes because school was now canceled for 2 weeks. Everything was canceled. What am I going to do with my kids now for like who knows how long? And so I actually started doing Zoom rooms for elementary kids, drop-in Zoom rooms 3 mornings a week, where we just played games, we read books, we sometimes would watch short videos together, and it was so interesting because so many parents reached out to me and said it was so nice that they knew their kid was doing something with someone, productive for a little while. And in the meantime, these kids were learning Zoom. And our schools pretty much just shut down and did nothing for a few weeks. And when they came back, all of the kids then had school in Zoom. And then I got all the parents saying, thanks for teaching my kids Zoom, because they were so comfortable with it when school started again. So it was an interesting transition for us in that way. One of the challenges of that was none of my volunteers were comfortable on Zoom. So a lot more of it fell on me. I had one teacher who recognized that they were going to have to be teaching on Zoom. So she started helping me so she could learn it. And she was a wonderful, wonderful helper in that. But yeah, it was a quick transition for us. We also went to pre-recorded services on Sundays, and so it was really easy for me to pull kids in and get them involved in that as well. So we were very blessed with staff that had the background to both go to Zoom Sunday school and go to pre-recorded services.
Thanks, everyone. Already fantastic ideas and suggestions and the opportunities and challenges before us with all these ways that we can do ministry with children in this time that we're in. We already have some questions that are coming up in the Q&A and in the chat. Please keep adding them as we go. But I want to launch into a question, and it comes to me as I think sometimes, especially when you're involved in ministry with young people, we become incredibly busy with everything that we have to do, all the stuff that needs to be done, and we can tend to sometimes forget why we're doing it in the first place. And it's often when we are pushed outside of our comfort zones or when we're challenged to do things in a new way that we're faced with this question of why. Why does children's faith formation matter? What do children mean to the church? What should the church mean to children? What's the point of what we're trying to do? So I want to ask our panelists, have you found yourself stepping back and asking these sorts of kind of bedrock questions, these foundational questions? And what have you learned along the way? And I'm going to turn to Natalie first to kick off our conversation for this part.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, I exist in a world where we're constantly asking ourselves, what's the why behind the what? It's permission for us to actually stop doing certain things, because if we can't identify the why behind the what, that's a problem. When you ask why kids, what's the importance, what's the relevance of childhood faith formation, anybody on this call, I'm sure, could give you a dissertation worth of information. But I think one of the clearest things for me is when, in one of the gospel accounts, the disciples ask Jesus, who's the most important in the kingdom? And he doesn't take any of them, which I'm sure they were really hoping for. He, in fact, takes a little child and places that little child before them and says, this is it, guys. Like, anybody who becomes like this. And so for us to be reminded of children in the kingdom, their presence in the church is so integral. Author David Fitch writes that presence, time spent with children, is actually a spiritual practice. It reminds us of who Jesus is. And I can tell you that is absolutely true. But even further down into that is this idea that well, we know that a great majority of people come to faith first as children, because it's the stuff that we are doing as children, no matter what that looks like, no matter what area or sphere of our lives, that's the foundational stuff for us. And so when it comes to spiritual development, for us to be able to spiritually develop kids from a young age allows them to build up an important just part of who they are. Discovering who they are in Christ is such a huge win. I've been doing a lot of reading, actually. I think this book right behind me. I've been doing a lot of reading on this guy here, Fred Rogers, and I'm just blown away by his understanding of children and his understanding of ministry to children, and what we can learn from him in that. And the why behind his what was to be able to teach kids to love God and love their neighbor. And won't you be my neighbor, right? And I think when it comes to childhood faith formation, this is the stuff that we are doing. We're teaching kids from a very early age to love God and love their neighbor, and that these are the most important foundations for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you bringing in that biblical reference to Jesus welcoming the child and saying, whoever welcomes this child is welcomes me. And we often, I think we forget, like, it took me a long time to realize, wait a minute, for that to happen, it meant that children needed to be there, part of the disciples. And so every time that Jesus was teaching and preaching and doing something, it meant that, even though it says it's often this focus on adults, it meant that there were children there as well. So I want to turn things over to Malinda to keep this conversation going.
Yeah, so I want to take what Natalie said as a kind of springboard and add a couple of things. So one, so Natalie mentions what we sometimes call the double love command, right? We are to love God and we are to love our neighbor. But there's another thing that's in there that we quickly bypass, okay? You also love yourself. So one of the things that I have found to be an important component of how we think about faith formation, especially, as I do that as an Anabaptist Mennonite kind of person, is to start really valuing the material out there about like a social emotional learning, okay, and how that becomes an important resource for us in the church. So that, because one of the things that we know tends to happen is that if we experience trauma or other kinds of emotional injuries as children, we carry those into adulthood. So I think another reason why children's faith formation matters is because, and I guess I want to urge us to keep a kind of longitudinal, a long view of this, is because the bad faith formation that happened to people who are now 70 years old shows up in how they interact with children, sometimes to the good because they don't want children to have that kind of negative experience they had, and sometimes for the worse because they never got healing from that kind of. Children are supposed to be quiet, seen and not heard. So I think there's children's faith formation matters because it is at the beginning of what I think of as a kind of circle. It's a really key kind of hermeneutical entry point into how we think about discipleship across the age span. I think the other piece of what I want to add here is that, let's see, what's the easiest way to say this? Because I don't want to turn this into a lecture. I'm a teacher, right? And because I'm teaching on Zoom these days, right? Like I'm feeling in the zone and want to just kind of launch into it here. But I think that this idea too, that how children experience community is also a huge part of self-acceptance and feeling like you are part of the fabric of the church and the faith family or the kinship of Christ. At the same time, I think when we think about Sunday school, Sunday school emerges around this, you know, as part of the kind of industrialization process, just the same way that public schools, you know, do. So these are two great paradigms for socializing children. And if there's one thing that I think the pandemic is trying to teach us, it is that the way we treat old people and the way we treat children has to change. And so we're being pushed, I think, as parents to try to go back to that kind of, I won't call it like pre-modern or postmodern or whatever, but to go back to those times when so much of children's socialization and formation was happening at home or in the immediate vicinity of extended family and neighborhood. So I think these are another piece of what we're being asked to pay attention to as we answer this question. Why does children's faith formation matter? Because it's about family, it's about community, it's about everything. Like children, how we treat children is a microcosm for all other components of how we experience social life as human beings.
Absolutely. It makes me think of your discussion about just the formative influence of Sunday school makes me think of Henry and your research. Of course, your research dealing with race, right? That's another pandemic that many people in many parts of the world are facing right now. So I'd love to hear you jump in and then we'll jump into another question after that.
Yeah, no, thanks. One of the things, Malinda and Natalie, great stuff as far as like the importance of faith formation and how that and Malinda, I resonate a lot with, you know, talking about, you know, your faith formation as a child affects you like on the life course, right? I mean, and to even think about that 72-year-old, like, and like how they treat kids, like that's tied into their faith formation as children. But yeah, I mean, faith formation, as I look at it, I mean, through like a lens, like sociological lens with like socialization. I mean, Malinda, you brought this up too. It's like we're socialized in lots of different areas, and sometimes, at least what I find in the academic world and like amongst sociologists, they forget about the church, like religion as a socializing institution. They do for like adults, but for children, they forget about that. And what I found is that that because that's forgotten a lot of the times, we don't spend a lot of time rethinking why we do what we do at church or how we do things at church. It's like, again, it's like we fall back on the old Sunday school paradigms, right? Again, and Malinda, you alluded to, that's tied into the Industrial Revolution and the dawn of schooling, like public schooling and all of this other stuff. And it's all curricular driven. And what we're finding now with the Zoom, it's hard to do curriculum. I mean, Becky, you're talking about, it's like, I'm trying to do this curriculum on Zoom. And so we're finding that it's not easy. And even my kids, like they're trying to interact with their teachers at school. And it's hard to like translate that into this relational, like, I mean, faith formation is relational. It should be relational. And so I think one of the things that this allows us to do this time, like this pandemic, and it forces the church, forces us as ministers, those of us who are leaders, to rethink and maybe reimagine like faith formation again, like into more than just cover up stuff and maybe like repaint pictures so that they have like diverse pictures, which is great. We need diversity and all of that stuff, and it's very important. But to actually reimagine and redo this idea of faith formation, try and think differently about it. To think, how do we do this more relationally? How do we pay attention to theme, like these overarching themes in the Bible, right? That we can teach children and that tie into a lot of the social things. Like, I mean, we're seeing a lot of social unrest when it comes to race and racism, and that's showing a lot of other things like class differences and all of these other things. And like, how do we make that a part of faith formation? Because I think we're also seeing that there's this again, this pandemic is unearthing this dearth of lack of faith formation in children linked to these social justice issues as well. So this gives us an opportunity to figure out how do we include that as part of faith formation as well. So
Yeah, absolutely. That idea of the relational nature of faith formation is just crucial. And I've noticed over the past number of years, there's been this shift gradually toward intergenerational ministry information, which is all about these relationships across people of different generations. Unfortunately, one of the things I've noticed over the past 6 months is that some of the practices that churches have been forging for building these relationships, for worshiping intergenerationally, what we've had to do as a result of the pandemic, sometimes, at worst, it undermines these practices and takes us back to, say, age segregated norms. And sometimes at best, it just puts these efforts, these intergenerational efforts, on hold. So what are some ideas for how churches can help children and youth and adults of all ages connect as we continue to keep our distance from each other? And Becky, I'd like to hear from you first.
So when I kind of thought about this, I was actually surprised by this question. And as I was talking about it with a few people, and we thought about this, several of them said, well, now that I think about it, since we've gone online, I feel like our kids are more involved in our community and in our church and in our worship services. And part of that is that I am staff. I have the time to devote to things like that, and I'm worship and Christian education. So I have a lot of say in asking people to do things in worship. But I think a lot of it is getting this. I feel like this pandemic opened doors for relationships in ways that weren't there before. One of the things that I did early on was visited each of the families at their home outside, socially distanced, and delivered a bag to them. And some of these kids hadn't talked to anybody for like 8 weeks other than their parents. And like, it was so fun to see, like, they just talked and talked and talked. But they also, they showed me their this is our play set, this is our yard, I planted this tree yesterday, let me show you a magic trick I've been working on. And it gave me the chance to see this. And as I experienced this, I thought, the congregation, the other people in our church community need to get to know these kids in this way. And so I started for my pre-recorded children's times for our church services on Sunday. I started when I would visit a family, I would, the family with the 3 pet bunnies, I videoed a conversation about their bunnies, and we talked about Jesus as the Good Shepherd. I had the boy who does his magic tricks, I had him do a magic trick for me, and then we talked, and I used that as an object lesson for something. And people were commenting and sending texts to these kids' parents. That was great. It was so, and it was building these relationships in those little ways, and those little touch points of seeing someone up there and seeing a part of them you didn't know before. And that was an amazing way of connecting, even when we were all still homebound at that point here, pretty much. And so that was just one way that we did that. I know who takes piano lessons. We have kids record, 10-second piano songs, and we use them in our services. And I have kids who will come in and record worship songs with the worship team that we then use. And they've gotten notes from older members of the congregation who loved seeing them up there. So I'm not sure that I did these things. I didn't think through this in the way of, I'm going to do these things specifically to build relationship. But that's what happened. And that was the beautiful thing, that as we all went through this trauma together, we still built relationships. And we have started regathering in phases now. And even now, as people come back, they'll see one of the kids and they'll say, oh, I loved when you did that. And I loved to see you do that at that online service. And they're remembering, the adults are remembering these things and reaching out to the kids, which was really, really neat to see.
Yeah, that just really highlights well I love what you say about, like, we're all experiencing this crisis together, right? We often think about age as something that separates us. And so we have to do this intentional work of bringing the generations together. But the crisis has hit everyone in different ways, but we're all facing it. And it is this unifying feature of life for us right now. It strikes me as I was listening to you that a lot of what has been done, a lot of what ministers and volunteers do for faith formation for children has really been put on hold or kind of been thrown up in the air. And there have been a lot of challenges we've had to face, but they've also given us, opportunities to try out new things, and to reimagine, as we already said earlier in this panel. So I'm wondering if we can finish our discussion before we move to questions, focused on this idea of challenges and opportunities. So what are some of the challenges that you've seen along the way, and how can we faithfully respond to them? And what are some of the opportunities, and how can we take hold of them? And Henry, let's jump to you first to talk about some of the challenges.
Yeah, I think, there are so many challenges, right? I mean, in dealing with this, because we're not used to interacting this way. Like, we're used to being in person, being able to like shake hands and like give hugs, like just be like, I remember one of the first things that happened when, we went into lockdown. I mean, we were able to like go on walks and stuff, and I'm walking my dog, and like you're going like this, and then you see someone and you could like take this big path around the next person, but you have this understanding, it's like, we're doing this because we don't want to infect each other maybe, or whatever. And I remember one of our neighbors, she's like, I just want to be able to pet a dog again. That's not mine. So I think that to tie that in with some of the challenges we're having with faith formation, and I think Natalie actually alluded to this earlier, is that, we're trying to figure out like, how do we connect, right, in this format, because we don't know how to do this. And so I think the first inclination was to over communicate. And that, I think that was a huge challenge. I mean, I remember seeing so many different people and like children's pastors in this area that I was connected with, and also talking with parents and stuff, that just so many were hearing from their parents that they're like, we get so many emails like from the school, and we're like on Zoom all the time, and the churches are like trying to have something every day, and so churches were being overworked, and parents were being overworked, and kids were like just on the screen the entire time, not like interacting and going out and whatever. But I think that's one of the challenges, is just trying to figure out how this works. Like, how do we still communicate and make connection when we can't like physically be close to each other, right? And I think we're in a lot of different areas, we're starting to figure that out. Like, I don't see a lot of schools sending so many emails out. I see a lot of churches trying to figure out, okay, so how do we actually pay attention to what we think is important for our church and for our kids and our families, and so backing up on the over communication. One other thing, another challenge that I think is, as I think about like, how do we do faith formation, is this idea of like, because we try to measure faith formation, and I know that's a hard thing to do, but our metrics, like, of how do we tell if a child is actually connecting, and how do we connect with these families, especially when we're not seeing them from week to week, or whatever, however many times a month they come to church and we intersect with them. I think trying to figure out, so again, going back to rethink, what is faith formation? Is it the ability for these children to show up to our Zoom meetings all the time? Or is it them being able to like recite the memory verse that we emailed to them, or whatever? Or is it just, I mean, like, Becky, I love your stories of like just interacting with the kids, and they're like excited to tell you about their pet bunny, or to show you a magic trick, or whatever. It's, I think it just, we have to rethink like what faith formation is, that there's more to it than just the Bible stories, right? That there are these spiritual things that are not tangible, but I think it's tied into our relationships, that we're actually maintaining these relationships with people. One other thing that I'll talk as far as a challenge that I'm seeing is, as churches are starting to open up a little bit, those that can meet in person, is I know at our church, some of the challenge is, the concern of having children interacting in these spaces when we're supposed to have this physical distancing, right? So for good reason, there's this concern of like not wanting to be exposed or possibly exposed to the virus, right? To COVID. And so I think that's another thing of like, as we start meeting together, that we need to figure out ways to still include those families, those children who choose to opt to wait, because they're still important, right? And faith formation still needs to happen. And so trying to figure out, I mean, at our university, like we're doing this hybrid model where I'm teaching in person and online at the same time, and it's driving me nuts. But it's like, as a church, we also have to figure out that too. It's like, how do we still minister and connect with people who are choosing to come, and then those who are choosing not to come? So I think those are a few challenges I think that we still need to work on. So
Great, thanks. Yeah.
So one of the things that we have found as a challenge and is that parents are overwhelmed. Parents are just don't know what to do with all this. And like you said, the over communication piece, I think, was a piece of that. But I think whether you have kids or not, this COVID fatigue is real. And so when you have kids, it just adds to that. We, in our area, our schools have all, in our districts in Lancaster County, have all gone back, which has overwhelmed parents again. And so with all that comes with that. And so that has been a challenge, to step back and say, what do the kids need, but what do parents need? Because the parents are such a huge part of faith formation in kids. And how do we support these parents? And at the beginning, it was just me taking their kids on Zoom. But at this point now, what do we do for parents? And I think that's something that we're going to need to keep working at. And it's something that has gotten so much more attention during this pandemic. And it's something that that we can continue to work on even as we come out of this. But another challenge that we had that somebody actually brought up was the Zoom fatigue. We did have kids. Once they started school on Zoom, I didn't do weekday Zooms. I just did Sunday school and our Wednesday evening kids Bible Zooms. But by May, they were done. They were just done. And so we took a break and we switched over the summer to a drop-in on Tuesday mornings, which also helped families who were not comfortable with big crowds. They could come early and not, maybe one other family was there, they would tell them they were comfortable with that family and they would invite them at that time. And it was spread out, but the kids sometimes got to see each other, and I would have activities and outdoor stuff that they could do. And then they would pick up a Zoom bag with lots of fun little things in them. And Wednesday mornings, we had Zoom again, and we had an object in there for object lessons. Sometimes we had a snack in there. We had a skit every week, and there was sometimes something in there for the skit. And those kids got so excited about Zoom again. I remember the second or third week, this family came on, and the girl said, "I'm so excited." And my helper was like, "Oh, what do you have going on this week?" And the child said, "No, for this." And my helper was like, "Oh, okay." She was like, "Wow, that's great." That was a teacher, so she was done with Zoom too. But so
it's oh, sorry. Well, we have to, unfortunately, we have to move on. But it's a perfect example of how a challenge leads to an opportunity. And Malinda, I'd like you to come in here. Just pretty briefly, yeah. We'll go to Natalie, and then I want to open it up for questions. And we'll leave this opportunity, this idea of opportunities into how we deal with the questions as well. So please ask your questions in the chat, in the question box, so that we can have those ready to go.
So building directly on what Becky was saying, the quality of the Zoom experience is shaped by the energy that we as individuals or leaders and households bring to it. So if people, I'm not saying that Zoom fatigue is not real. What I'm saying is that we can shift that energy by not getting so consumed by the technology and allowing it to be to say this is a channel for us to communicate and build a relationship. I mean, I could talk about that for a long time. The other thing that I want to say in terms of naming opportunities is that there's an opportunity for us adults to remember our own childhood, right? What worked for us? What didn't work for us? Because the chances are that many of us were either at home with one of our parents there full time, or if we were in, I mean, we're also, you know, I'm a Gen Xer, right? So we're part of the latchkey generation. The rates of divorce start increasing, so maybe there's a single parent situation, right? But there's an opportunity for us to think about what worked from our childhood, what kinds of buttons or triggers are getting activated from our childhood by the situation we find ourselves in. At our house, we use snuggle buddies. Everybody's got one, including the grown-ups. And if we are feeling overwhelmed and can't use our words, we can talk about feeling red, blue, green, or yellow, right? And it shifts what's going on in our brain. There's another opportunity here that we use at our house, which is to find little corners and build altars. We have, I got these from 10,000 Villages, these kissy stone hearts that say things like courage, peace, smile. And if you need a little pick-me-up, you just grab one and stick it in your pocket, and it's there. We also love Salvadoran crosses. So there are ways to reshape the landscape of your home, and it's going to do a lot for the landscape inside. And for us, this has opened up because we have also gone outside. And so building nature tables, worshiping outside, having family time outside helps us also learn from what, you know, is an ancient part of Christian tradition, the second book of Scripture. So these are just a few of the opportunities that I would encourage people to take advantage of.
Oh, so rich, so full of ideas. And yeah, I'd love to hear you go on and on about everyone, about all of these ideas. I want to turn things to Natalie for a final quick opportunity, and then we have some questions coming in.
I'll make this as quick as I can. 3 quick things as far as opportunity go. One, I think now is the time for us to amplify the reality for parents that they are the primary disciplers of their kids. For far too long, that's been put on the back burner. We need to amp that up. 2, it is also our opportunity as ministry leaders to really see our role as supporters and encouragers and cheerleaders for parents. And so for us to be able to recognize how parents need to be supported. Maybe that's simply a listening ear on the phone. Remember the phone when we used to just talk and not see people? Maybe it's just a listening ear on the phone. Maybe it's sitting on their, front porch or driveway and dropping them off a coffee and saying a quick prayer with them and being on our way. And whatever we can do to support and amp up, be like the Aaron and her arms for parents in this season, I think is really important and a great opportunity. And third, I think it's just to be really creative with some of our approaches. One thing that we did in this season that was really creative, I think, outside of my realm of creativity at least, was we created a weekend experience that was family camp, but every family had the camp in their own backyard, and they would connect on an online interface, and then the parents, after the kids went to bed, would actually connect through, what do you call that app? WhatsApp. Would just connect through a WhatsApp group where they could just share frustrations and prayer requests and best practices and all that kind of stuff. And it worked really well, and people got excited again about family at home discipleship, which I think is beautiful. And yeah, I'll end there. Thanks, Steve.
Well, that's fantastic. A lot of our questions actually are about parents and enabling and empowering parents. So another perfect segue.
All right, so I've been monitoring the questions as they have been coming in. And one of the very first question that was asked here is about Jesus. Hang on, I just lost that question. It was right here in front of me. Did someone see it? And the rest of us? How are we talking about Jesus, leading our kids to Jesus, nurturing Jesus, telling those stories about Jesus at this time? Who wants to take that one?
Hey, I'd be happy to jump in. I talk about Jesus-centered parenting all the time. Everything that we do for our own spiritual development, we can invite our kids into at an age-appropriate level. as we're talking about Jesus, we're excited about Jesus, we're reading about Jesus and experiencing him in new and fresh ways, we can then turn that into a conversation with our kids. Even when your kids are as young as, 2 or 3 years old, mommy just had this nudge from Jesus and this is what it was, or I just read this story about Jesus where he did X, Y, and Z, and isn't that beautiful? We have the ability every single day to point our kids to Jesus in so many conversations. But it's all about how we experience what we experience and the reality that we need to be actually articulating that and sharing that with our kids.
Great. Thank you, Jenna, for that question, and Natalie for the response. Brian says, we are doing okay with preparing pre-recorded virtual lesson content, but how can we keep kids connected to each other? Becky, you talked about this a bit as you were talking, especially when kids and families are zoomed out, meaning schools are still happening virtually. And then piggybacking on that, he's also asking you in particular, Henry, any recommendations for nurturing children in racial justice issues? So 2 questions here from Brian.
Well, I'll take the beginning part if you want, the part about how do you connect kids when we can't actually be around each other and they're zoomed out. I actually did, I would reach out to families if they weren't in Zoom, and sometimes if parents were overwhelmed and, respectfully, if they don't want to participate, that's fine. But I would also offer them, hey, do you want me to just Zoom with your kids myself and have a conversation so they can talk to somebody other than you or their teachers? And a lot of times when that would happen, it would get them back excited, and I'd talk about the other kids, and then they'd end up coming back to our Zoom. We would also, like I said, we had outdoor drop-in times when families, it can be so different in all of our different places, what the regulations are and what is safe in different places. But, based on what's safe in where you are, we even now are doing things inside with smaller groups, connecting families that they can get together outside. You can use the church if you want to come with this other family. It takes a lot of intentionality to start. But I found that once I was very intentional about it at the beginning, the parents would then take it over and they would start connecting their kids. So once you get them reconnected, I found it wasn't all on me then.
Henry, you want to add a word here about social justice and helping educate kids for social justice at this time?
Yeah, real quick. One of the things that I found in my research is that don't leave it out. I found that like in curriculum and in Sunday schools and stuff, it's like race and gender, like these social justice issues have been left out or erased. So it's when you have an opportunity, like the Good Samaritan, the story of the Good Samaritan and the ethnic tensions between the Samaritans and the Jews, this is something that you can bring in, right, into these conversations. So I think it's when there's an opportunity to do it, bring it in. Don't be, you're going to make mistakes because people are like, oh, I'm scared I might make a mistake. And that's okay. We all make mistakes when it comes to these issues, but don't erase it. I think that's the biggest thing that I found is that it gets erased. And if you're wanting resources, there's like as far as like trying to read the Bible through different racial lenses, like there's Reading While Black just came out. And there are other good resources that are out there. But I think the big thing is just don't shy away from it. Don't leave it out. Because when we do, then the dominant ideologies about race and gender and all these things will fill in that void. And that's something that we don't want to do. So.
Can I just add?
Go ahead, Malinda.
So I'm not quite sure how to, so somebody asked about Snuggle Buddies. Generation Mindful is the name of the company. You can do a quick internet search for that. The other thing I would like to just add about the racial justice stuff is start by asking what children are noticing. Because it can be really, if we start from I want to make sure that my children aren't racists, and so we just give them information, we may actually be missing what they're paying attention to and what they are wondering about, just intuitively.
Mm-hmm. As we move toward closing here, I want to tell you one announcement and then thank our panelists. So announcement-wise, I want to tell you about the new ING podcast from Menno Media and Leader Magazine. We are centering this ING podcast on living, growing, and being. Let me share the logo here with you so you can all see it. The podcast is starting up here in the next month. In our first episode, our host, Reverend Dr. Dennis Edwards, sits down with Dr. Soong-Chan Rah, Professor of Church Growth and Evangelism at North Park University in Chicago. Dr. Rah will be sharing some of his lived experience around diversity in the church, and will be challenging us to think about what might be in need of disrupting or unsettling in order to find new life. When you get the link in an email to the recording of today's webinar, you will also get more information on this new podcast. So just want to alert you to that new initiative as well, coming from Menno Media. Thank you so much to all of our panelists today, to Dave as our facilitator. I really appreciate your time, your insights. I know we didn't get to all the questions, but I think the longer you talk, the more questions that come up, the more we long to debrief these things with each other. So I know we're all leaving with fresh ideas for faith formation. Thank you to all who have joined us today in this webinar. Again, we have recorded it and we will post the link on Menno Media's Facebook page, our YouTube channel, and you'll receive it in an email later this week. Thank you all for joining us. Have a good afternoon.